But I really want to get on stage our Wonder Woman, writer, director, and actress of The Sounding, Catherine Eaton, and co-writer Brian Delaney.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Is it working? Can you hear me? Is this on? Yeah? Can you guys hear me? Yes, okay. Thank you very much. You're going to make me cry, and I think you've seen me cry enough. So, yeah, thank you so much. I just want to say up front, first of all, a huge thank you to Stony Brook Film Festival and all of you. Thank you for staying. Thank you for staying through the credits. The people who made this film are extraordinary, and some of them are in the audience now, but the film festival itself is just an amazing experience for us as filmmakers. It's curated brilliantly. They treat us like we're doing something important, so I really, really appreciate it. It's amazing to be here. So I just want to introduce some of my cast and crew are in the audience now. I'm going to have them stand up, and I'll just introduce them all at once, and then you guys can look for them after, and you can ask them all the tough questions that you don't want to ask me right now, and they'll tell you the truth. So two of my cast members are here. Carolyn Baumler, who played Shut Up. Can you stand up? And Deborah Rain, who played Hannah, the one that gives the punch. She's there. She's also a co-producer on the film. Bruno Lira, who is an executive producer on the film. Bruno, where are you? Oh, in the back there. Oh, nice, and you're shooting. Thank you. Jeremiah Kipp, who is my first AD, who was amazing, and now he's a phenomenal director in his own right. David Marcus, are you here? You're here somewhere. He did additional editing on the film, but I can't see you now. Anyway, and there may be other people that I don't know came, but so yeah, so we're just gonna, I guess we'll take your questions.
So this is the time for questions and answers. Again, you ask the questions, they give the answers, and you can always text or tweet rather your questions to #SBFF. So let me guess, do we have any questions?
If you don't, I can just tell stories.
Yes, yes ma'am.
So the question is, where did this take place? The story of the film is that it's on an island off the coast of Maine. Where we actually shot is a combination of, and tell no one this, it's a secret, but we shot on Monhegan Island, which is 12 miles out to sea, which is literally off the coast of Maine. And we also shot in Long Island. So the house that you see is all in Glen Cove, all the exteriors there, and then we married the two of them. But don't tell anyone in Maine that. We like them to think we shot the whole thing there. But it was really here.
Yes, ma'am.
None. No, I'm kidding.
So the question was, what is your Shakespeare background?
Yeah, what was my Shakespeare background? I'm classically trained. I came up as an actor, and I still act. This is my first feature. And I had done most of Shakespeare's plays. I've played, I've played a role in most of his plays, and then also studied the sonnets and things like that, but all as a practitioner. So, yeah, so that's kind of where I fell in love with them. Do you guys want to hear the crazy story of how this character was originated? Yeah? It's a little crazy. You have to keep it totally within this room, okay? It's our secret, because if it gets out,
She's never
people
told
might
anyone
think,
else before.
No, I've never ever done this at a Q&A. So the story is, it's not how it became a movie. It actually first was a one-woman show. And what happened was I had studied as an actor. I was classically trained. I had moved out to Los Angeles to become famous. And I was living in LA, and I was actually doing really well and very happy. And I got a phone call that my mom had fallen and broken her ankle, and that it was very severe. And my brother was married and had a real job. And my sister was in college, and so I was the natural choice to go home and take care of her because somebody needed to help her out. So I went back to Vermont, which is where she was from, and I thought I would be there for 2 weeks helping her out. And 6 months later, I was still there. And I was working on a farm to help cover the medical bills because you can't at that time, you could not make a living as an artist in Vermont full-time as an actor. So I was working on this farm, which was a complete pity job because I can't grow anything. Like, they gave it to me as a mercy. It was sort of like, give the girl something. So I came home one day, and it was, 6 months in. It's much longer than I thought I was going to be there, and I'm in my overalls, and I'm covered in mud and muck from the farm, and I bring my mom out, and I give her dinner, and I help her to bed, and I found myself craving being surrounded by the language that I loved, the poetry that I had been trained on. And I pulled out my complete works of Shakespeare, and I started tearing out the pieces of the book that I loved the most and hanging them on the walls. And by the morning, the house looked like that scene in A Beautiful Mind when Russell Crowe's completely bonkers and it's covered and there's like twine and conspiracy theories and stuff. There was no twine, but otherwise it was pretty much the same thing. There was no Russell Crowe either, but otherwise it was the same. And I brought my mom out for breakfast, and she was understandably concerned. But I had started to think about, I started to wonder what would happen if someone chose this language today. Why was I craving it so much, a modern contemporary woman in a contemporary circumstance, and yet this is the language that I needed in that moment to get through what I needed to get through. So what would happen if someone chose this as their actual language? Why would they do that today? And I had started to have the ideas for Live at that point, and I was a practicing Buddhist at the time, so I was also very interested in the idea of language being detached from our language and not seeing language as action. I was curious about the thought that we have started to or sometimes use language as if that is the action itself, and what would happen if somebody wanted to make sure that everyone was only able to see their language as language, if they chose something so heightened and so specific that it could only be seen that way and not misconstrued. So for instance, I use the example that if somebody says, "I love you," or "I'll protect you," those words are beautiful words, and speaking those words is an incredible action in and of itself, but it's not the action of love, and it's not the action of protection. Those are made up of, hundreds of actions woven together over time that create those things in real life. So I was curious about that. So she was born, and then I put that crazy, this sort of War and Peace version of the play was created, where this character was sort of coming out of it, this woman who was speaking Shakespeare, this crazy acquired language. And then I put it in a drawer because my mom got better, and I went to New York to resume my acting career, and I met this fine, tall Hibernian man here. And he asked me, he's a writer all the time, playwright and a screenwriter now and television writer, and he asked me if I had ever written anything, and I told him about this play where it was this woman who used Shakespeare's language as her own and then defended her right to speak that way. And he said he thought that there was something really special in the idea of someone taking on an acquired language and using that language to defend herself. So then we worked on it together. And
yeah, and maybe just a small little sort of story to follow on from that, which was, Catherine had never written anything before and presented me with this very beautiful, very dense, very layered text. And that I immediately saw, there was a kind of, I thought there was sort of a little bit of genius in it, because here was this woman who sort of clothed herself in the mantle of this language, which just happens to be the most kind of extraordinary flowering of poetry and philosophy and thinking and love and everything else that exists. And so everything that she said in this text sort of made her seem wiser than the other characters. And so there was something extraordinary in this. And we worked on the story by touring it around Ireland, where I'm from. We literally got into my beat-up old car, like the old fit-up theatre companies with a little box of sort of trinkets for a set. And we kind of literally drove around and put on the show, the one-woman show that Catherine did, in little, churches and graveyards and little town halls, and sometimes big theatres in Cork. And some nights we had 3 people in, and other nights 300, and we sort of refined it as we went along.
And those 3 people, I'm not proud of this, but we played in a lot of churches in Ireland. It's often where theaters performed, and I'm not proud of this, but one night we did have 3 people and a dog, and those 3 people were recruited from the cemetery where they were paying respects to their loved ones. And we were like, "Come see a show."
I was in impresario mode, and I was at the back near the graveyard going, "Roll up, beautiful girls, beautiful girls."
And then we went on and took the show to Lincoln Center and Carnegie Hall, and it ended up being performed. I guess I'll just tell you the full story of how it became a movie. So the one-woman show was the last scene in the film. The play was just the last scene between Michael and Liv, but very densely written. And we took it all over the place, like Brian was saying, and then it went to Lincoln Center, Carnegie Hall, and then I was doing this series of artist salons at the Roger Smith Hotel on 47th and Lexington. And they have an artistic director there because the hotel is owned by a famous sculptor, James Knowles. And I did a piece of the play in one of these artist salons that I was running. And Matt, the artistic director, said, I think you should do this in our glassed-in storefront performance space downstairs, which is on 47th and Lexington. Glassed in, you perform inside the glass, and the sound is piped out onto the streets of New York. He said it takes place in the observation room of a psychiatric center, and 10,000 people walk by every 4 hours. You'll never be more observed in your life. And I said no, because I thought that the play required that people buy a ticket and sit down and demand that I tell them a story, so they really listen, because I felt it was too esoteric and too dense for something like that. And Matt just wore me down and said, why are you in New York then? And he was right. So we reconceived the play to be this hyper-white, modern, brightly lit, fluorescent lighting observation room, and inside was a woman in a gown scrawled in Shakespeare, spouting out Shakespeare's lines, and they were being spilled out onto the streets of New York. And it became this kind of cult hit. The sidewalks got backed up so much that the police had to come, because it was a fire hazard, and cars would stop at the intersection and not go on, and stockbrokers came, and they were like talking on their phone the whole time, but they watched, and pizza delivery guys who didn't speak English, but the pizzas got cold, and homeless people came and banged on the glass, and they would say, I'll get you out! I'm not even kidding. It's a true story. It was crazy. And every night this one man came, and he was always wearing a tuxedo, and so I thought he was a caterer, because I don't know anyone else who wears a tuxedo every single night. But he had a peach-colored newspaper under his arm, the Financial Times. And so the guys in the back jokingly called him the financier, and they said, oh, has the financier come tonight? Did the financier come tonight? And the last night of the play, he waited for me afterwards and said, I'd like to turn your play into a feature film. I know. Amazing, right? I know, it's amazing. Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, thanks. It changed my life, so. It changed our lives. So
this is the easiest Q&A I've ever had to do.
I feel like I should pull up a chair, pour a cup of coffee.
Yes, we have a question back there. Yeah. So just to repeat the question in case you couldn't hear, although you have great projection, what was the choice around her not speaking? Because everything we've been talking about is about the play, which was only the part of the film where she does speak Shakespeare. So he was saying, what led to the decision that she didn't speak? And I can say that that was always a part of the backstory of the character, even when it was in play form, because I wanted it to be, I guess because my own curiosity came out of someone who was choosing this language, not someone who, I don't know, where the language was weirdly imposed on them in some way, or where they were sort of born speaking Shakespeare. I was curious about someone who chose it, and I felt that it needed to be somebody who communicated in a different way. And I'm very interested personally in the communication that happens underneath language. I think that language is incredibly beautiful, and I've built a career on it in a lot of ways, but what's real to me is what's happening while we're speaking, what's happening underneath, the kind of subconscious communication that happens when two human beings, or 800 human beings and two human beings are in a room together. That communication that's happening, all the things that are saying, do you trust me? I trust you. Does this matter? Am I impatient? Am I okay? Am I safe? All those kind of things that are happening under the surface of what we're saying is really valuable. And for me, I felt that most likely this character would come from someone who understood that level, and then she could put the Shakespeare on top of that. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. If you're asking specifically why she stopped, thank you. Thanks. We should talk after. Or not. If you're asking, sorry. If you're asking specifically why she stopped speaking to begin with, that's one where Brian likes to say the film doesn't tell us. So it's kind of up to you to decide.
I mean, there are cases of, something that's called selective mutism, where, children invariably at a young age, for all kinds of reasons, stop talking, and it can last many, many years, and sometimes it ends during adolescence. And actually, since we made this film, a few people have sort of come out of the woodwork who've seen it and spoken to us about their children or their nephews or nieces who've had this. And so that was sort of in or around the idea without us getting too specific about that. But Catherine actually explored what it meant to be silent. She actually went to Maine for a month without speaking and just moved out into the community and lived without speaking to kind of get into what this would mean, and had a sort of extraordinary experience doing that as well. So it was just that whole notion of silence and speech, and the difference between, you know, absolute silence and then, you know, as I say, sort of the greatest flowering of the English language, and those two sitting against each other as modes to live. You know, she goes from absolute silence and nothingness and yet profound presence and connection with her grandfather, with the world, with nature, with her place, to then giving this gift to her grandfather on his deathbed, which was the language that he wanted to fill her life with, and then using that, cloaking herself in that mantle to go through the rest of her life, sort of as a homage to him and as a way of keeping him with her. So, I don't know, we just found it very layered and complex and interesting, and both very, very extreme choices. And so this kind of outlier aspect of her nature was something that we were, you know, super keen to kind of delve into as well.
Yes, a question back there.
So the question is, why did we choose Harris Yulin, the actor that plays the grandfather that plays Lionel, and whether or not he had retired after training day? He had not retired, but he is more selective about what he takes. The story with Harris, I love that man with my entire life. He's an extraordinary actor. I did not know him before this film. I knew of his work. And when we were making decisions about the Lionel character, there wasn't anybody else that could have done this with it. So we reached out to him through our casting director, who had a very strong reputation. We reached out to him, and Harris asked to read the script. We sent him the script, and he was the only one of all the actors that read or were considered that were quote unquote names or had kind of very established careers that took the part without speaking to me, without meeting me, and I asked him afterwards, so basically he said yes, we were thrilled, and then he said, but I'd like to meet her now. So he said, why don't you come? He said, why don't you come to Juilliard, where I'm directing Richard III? Let me school you. He didn't say that, but that's what I felt like. I thought, oh God, I better know what I'm doing. He said, why don't you come to Juilliard, where I'm directing Richard III, and watch the production, and we'll have tea afterwards, and then I'm meeting some friends for dinner. And I said, great. So I went to see it. It was brilliant. And then I met him, and he's an incredibly kind, sensitive man, but he also does not suffer fools. So we sat there for tea, and I asked him why, and he questioned me about Richard III. He's incredibly hungry and curious about people and art, and so he quizzed me about that. And then I asked him, why did you say yes to this without even seeing if, here's new director, actor, writer, directing her first feature, and you said yes without even meeting me? And he said, I felt that anybody who could create that script must have the kind of humanity behind them that I would want to work with regardless, which was a huge honor. I mean, it was just incredibly moving. And then we just had an incredible time, and I stayed with him. I stayed on through his friend's dinner. I was invited. And then we became, he came and did rehearsals. We rehearsed, we had the luxury it was really important to me to rehearse for 5 days at the beginning of this process with the main actors, the leads. And I rehearsed with him. He's incredibly specific. He wants to put pressure on every single word and make sure it deserves to be in the script and in the character's mouth. But once you win that trust over, he will, go to the nth degree for you. And he just did me such an honor, because he's been directed by, for those of you who don't know, he's done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of films and been directed by all the best directors in the world. I mean, just an amazing career. And yet he gave me so much respect and so much warmth, both as an actor in our scenes and as a director on the set. So I just think the world of him.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so the question is, who was the man in the tuxedo? You mean his actual name? I won't name the poor, like, there's a lot of filmmakers in this audience, and I can imagine he'll get a lot of phone calls. But he was our first investor, so he was our seed money, and he did actually end up, like, literally changing my life. He owns a hedge fund. He had never invested in a film before, but there was something about this story that spoke to him, and then he and I, and then he and Brian and I, and then he and his family, and Brian and I all went on this long journey of discovering what that meant, you know, to turn this into a film. So, and then the other part of the question was, how did we get Danny Burstein, who played Dr. Anderson in this? He was recently Tevye on Broadway and in Shakespeare in the Park, and Danny and I performed on Broadway together. So I knew him through that. He's a gorgeous, wonderful, brilliant, beautiful actor who's very transformative. He's not mean. He's wonderful. And I would work with him anytime. So yeah, he's phenomenal.
Thank you, Kathryn Eaton.
Thank you
Brian
guys so
Delaney.
much. Thank you. Thank you.